Emily here. Welcome to my channel where I am teaching and training and making literary scholars. Today I'm going to talk to you about my 5 favorite classic children's literature novels of all time. I'm going to read a little passage from each. I'm going to tell you why it's significant, a little bit of information about each, and why I love these books. So if you are a true literary scholar, you will definitely want to read some classic children's literature, because classics in the day, we're talking, if we're looking at the Water Babies, all the way through 1950s, particularly in the golden age of children's literature. Children's literature at the time read like adult novels today, and it's mind-blowing to me how children could read some of the books that are known as classic children's literature that I do not think would happen for the age range in this day and age. So let's get started. My first, probably my most favorite classic children's novel of all time, which reads like an adult novel, has to be Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson is a Scottish author, and this was written, by the way, in 1881, and it actually was originally published in a serial, magazines and serial books that were put out in installments for children at the time, and it is probably the most influential work ever done that influenced how we view modern pirates in not only television, cinema, literature, and just what we think of when we think of pirate. All of that stems back to Treasure Island. It's absolutely brilliant. Very dark. The violence in Treasure Island was shocking for the time it was written, especially when it's supposed to be for children. When you read it, this is like an adult novel. So I don't know how it's considered children's literature, but it is. It's absolutely fascinating, and it was obviously mostly written for boys. I find it an adventure story more than anything that could be for adults, advanced children, probably more high school and up. And it is absolutely brilliant, and we'll talk a little bit about it. But in this, we meet, Jim Hawkins, Billy Bones, Captain Smollett. We meet, talked about Jim Hawkins, Long John Silver. Long John Silver is probably one of the most well-known characters in pirate history. He is a good person that became not so good, influenced by greed. He is what we associate with the typical pirate, with the parrot, talking parrot on the shoulder, and the eye patch, and the bandana or scarf with the hair tied back, and the dirty clothes, and the shiver me timbers. That is all Long John Silver. Comes from Treasure Island. And there's a lot of speculation what Robert Louis Stevenson used for his inspiration for Treasure Island, which island it's supposed to be. So if you want to research that, it's very fascinating. There's some most likely culprits, and you can see pictures and descriptions and see why it matches the book below. So that's very interesting to me. So in this book, it's mostly told from the narrator of a boy, Jim Hawkins, who's like a preteen. I don't know, maybe he's like 12, 13 or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm so tired, you guys. But anyway, he and his mom own kind of a seafaring lodge, and one day, captain comes in, who warns, keep an eye out for this, dangerous buccaneer who might be showing up here soon. Not long later, Jim Hawkins, his father, dies, and the captain dies, and all heck breaks loose in this seafaring lodge. Jim Hawkins and his mother escape with a treasure map, and Jim ends up joining a crew of mutineers to kind of go after this treasure in this location, and a whole host of adventurous things happen. It's very, very interesting, and it's told partly narration, partly journal style. It's really interesting the way that it's structured as well. You'd have to read that. So I'm going to read a little bit of a passage from here as well. My favorite. Whoopsie-daisy. Book alert. Okay, so let's read a little here. I just want to read you the very beginning of chapter 1 and the kind of the description of what we're talking about when we're talking about these pirates. We have, I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow, a tall, strong, heavy, nut brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulders of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred with black broken nails, and the sabre cut across one cheek, a dirty, livid white. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. 15 men on the dead men's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Anybody getting some Pirates of the Caribbean parallels here? Obviously, Pirates of the Caribbean was richly steeped in being inspired by Treasure Island, with Captain Jack Sparrow largely also influenced his character by Long John Silver. Sang in his high, tottering voice that seemed to have been tuned and broken at the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of a stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. I mean, does this look like a children's novel to you? I mean, come on. Looked at him through the curtain door before he entered the parlor, and he always was sure to be as silent as a mouse when any such was present. For me, and this is from the character of the boy Jim Hawkins, at least there was no secret about the matter, for I was a sharer in his alarms. He had taken me aside one day and promised me a silver fourpenny on the very first of the month if I would keep my weather eye open for a seafaring man with one leg, and let him know the moment he appeared. Often enough, when the first of the month came around and I applied to him for my wage, he would only blow through his nose at me and stare me down. Keep an eye out for that seafaring man with one leg. How that personage haunted my dreams, I need scarcely tell you. On stormy nights, when the wind shook the four corners of my house and the surf roared along the cove and up the cliffs, I would see him in 1,000 forms, this one-legged man, and with 1,000 diabolical expressions. Now the leg would be cut off at the knee, now at the hip. Now it was a monstrous kind of a creature who had never had but the one leg, and that in the middle of his body. To see him leap and run and pursue me over hedge and ditch was the worst of nightmares. And altogether, I paid pretty dear for my monthly fourpenny apiece in the shape of these abominable fancies. But though I was so terrified by the idea of a seafaring man with one leg, I was far less afraid of the captain himself than anybody else who knew him. So we can skip around a little. We get over here to some more about that man. His stories were what frightened people worst of all. Dreadful stories they were about hanging, walking the plank, storms at sea, the dry Tortugas, and wild deeds and places on the Spanish Main. By his own account, he must have lived his life among some of the wickedest men that God ever allowed upon the sea. And the language in which he told these stories shocked our plain country people almost as much as the crimes that he described. So, such a beautiful book. Like, considering it's like the most vivid, alive, nautical descriptions of pirates and seafaring adventures, and beautiful language, fantastic imagery, rich in symbolism. It keeps you on the edge of your seat. It is very, very, very well written. I absolutely love it. I highly recommend The Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And you can talk about why this shouldn't be a children's novel in today's age compared to when it was at the time, etc., etc. All right, so let's move on to my number 2. My number 2 is on my list, George MacDonald, 1872, The Princess and the Goblin. My precious, I love it so much. Gothic literature is my favorite. This is one of the earliest examples of a children's Gothic literature. This has all the Gothic elements. It has, okay, back up. Too enthusiastic. Princess and the Goblin is a children's fantasy novel written in the Gothic tradition. There you go. So we have fantasy literature elements and Gothic themes, Gothic landscape, Gothic everything else. So we have damsel in distress. We have a broken down, dilapidated, cold, and clammy castle with cavernous underground mines, Gothic. We have storm and wind and rain and cold. We have supernatural. We have fantasy elements. We have goblins, or creatures, which are listed as a whole other race that lives underground in these caverns. We have a prince who comes to the rescue, which is the boy called Katy. We have basically, yeah, I'd say most Gothic elements. Maybe there's a few that are missing because it is more fairy tale, but it's technically considered Gothic literature. So this is about the Princess Irene, who is, I think, supposed to be young, 8 to 10 years old, and she has no mother, of course. Her father is busy with the kingdom. He's a king. She comes across the ghost of her great-great-grandmother, who guides her and protects her. In the castle, she goes around and exploring this castle by slipping away from her nanny or her governess, whatever you call it at the time. I keep getting text messages. Anyway, so she befriends this boy named Katy. Katy and Irene discover these goblins, this whole other race. So there's a lot of racial like symbolism in here. This lower race who lives underground, who's below us, below the royalty. They're called goblins. And Katy discovers that there's a plot for the goblins to do all this, evildoer stuff, eventually come and try to kidnap the Princess Irene, or Irene, I call her Irene. And Katy, of course, is the prince who saves the damsel in distress, etc., etc. But there's a lot of social themes in this book, which is very, if you want to, I'm working on a Gothic to horror literature greatest works complete course that I'll be selling for anybody to take, and it's going to include this book, but mostly this does fit in onto the timeline, and it really is a great book for showing how two genres, the Gothic and the fairy tale or fantasy, comes together. Especially for the time it was written, it was kind of revolutionary as well, especially in a children's book. By the way, I absolutely adore, and I have a bunch of these. You'll see these Puffin Classics. They're cute, they're little, they're pretty. You can see in the front all the different ones you can get. These are just some of them. I have a few others I'll show you. I'll link these all below in the comments if you're interested in these versions. They look really nice stacked on your shelf. They're like little half-size books. And most of them have a little bit of illustration at the beginning of each. So I'm going to just do a little bit of an intro read here. So the first chapter is called Why the Princess Has a Story About Her. And it's like, once upon a time, a narrow introduction to the princess. And then when we get into the chapter 1, that's when we learn about the actual princess. There was once a little princess whose father was king over a great country full of mountains and valleys. His palace was built upon one of the mountains and was very, very grand and beautiful. The princess, whose name was Irene, was born there, but she was sent soon after birth, because her mother was not very strong, to be brought up by country people in a large house, half castle, half farmhouse, on the side of a mountain, halfway between its base and its peak. The princess was a sweet little creature, and at the time my story begins, she was about 8 years old. That's what I thought. I think, but she was getting older fast. Her face was fair and pretty, with eyes like two bits of night sky, each with a star dissolved in the blue. Those eyes, you might have thought, must have known they came from there, so often were they turned up in that direction. The ceiling of her nursery was blue, and the stars in it as like the sky as they could make it. But I doubt if ever she saw the real sky with the stars in it, for a reason which I had better mention at once. These mountains were full of hollow places underneath, huge caverns and winding ways, some with water running through them and some shining with all colors of the rainbow where a light was taken in. There would not have been much known about them had there not been mines there, great deep pits with long galleries and passages running off from them, which had been dug to get at the ore, of which the mountains were full. In the course of digging, the miners came upon many of these natural caverns. A few of them had far openings cut out on the side of the mountain or into a ravine. So we're already getting into like the Gothic landscape here. Now in these subterranean caverns lived a strange race of beings called by some gnomes, by others kobolds, and by some goblins. There was a legend current in the country that at one time they had lived above ground and were very like other people. But for some reason or other, concerning which there were different legendary theories, the king had laid what they thought too severe taxes upon them, or had required observances of them that they did not like, or had begun to treat them with more severity in some way or another, and impose stricter laws, and the consequence was that they all had disappeared from the face of the country. You see, we're getting into some symbolism with social class here. According to the legend, however, instead of going to some other country, they had all taken refuge in the subterranean caverns, whence they never came out but at night, and then seldom showed themselves in any numbers, and never to many people at once. It was only in the least frequented and most difficult parts of the mountains they were said to gather even at night and in the open air. Those who had caught sight of them, that they had generally altered in the course of generations, and no wonder, seeing they lived away from the sun in the cold, wet, dark places. They were now ordinarily ugly, but absolutely hideous, ludicrously grotesque in face and form. There was no invention of the most lawless imagination expressed by pen or pencil that they could surpass the extravagance of their appearance. So love it. So beautifully written. Like, I'm really a sucker for lyrical, descriptive, vivid imagery, and this book really pays off. Princess and the Goblin, George MacDonald, highly recommended. Absolutely adore it. Okay, let's move on to next on my list is Heidi, Joanna Spyri, 1880 to 1881. All right, now this is probably one of the greatest known works of Swiss literature ever written, according to many experts, reviewers. So it is basically about a 5-year-old girl named Heidi who goes to live with her paternal grandfather up in the Swiss Alps. And he's like an old, godless, Scrooge type miser who has no place, no room, and no interest in a child whatsoever. And this girl, of course, just comes in with her rosy alpine cheeks and her sunny disposition and, whimsical, frolicking nature, and transforms him. So this story is not only about more of an orphan finding home and her development. It's more about the development and evolution of character change in the grandfather, which would be a great character analysis topic for a book. And how the two both evolve and grow together, and they kind of save each other in essence. But it's so lovely. I've read this book many times, and it's so pretty. I mean, I've been to Switzerland. I've not been to the Swiss Alps. I've been to Lucerne and some of the lakeside areas, going through to Vienna, to Germany and Vienna, but I've not been to the Swiss Alps. My father has hiked all over the Swiss Alps, and of course I've seen video. And this book will quite literally bring you to the Swiss Alps. I mean, it is just the most beautiful descriptions of setting and nature and alpine life you could imagine. It's very well written. It's not juvenile in any way. It's obviously written in the 1800s, and thus translated, but it is probably could read well for, a very clean reading for an adult as well. So let me read you the back. At the age of 5, oh, this is another one of those Puffin Classics, by the way. So these are all from my Puffin Classics collection. Love them. I'll link this one below. At the age of 3, little orphan Heidi is sent to live with her grandfather in the Alps. Everyone in the village is afraid of him, but Heidi is fascinated by his long beard and bushy gray eyebrows. She loves her life in the mountains, playing in the sunshine and growing up amongst the goats and the birds. But one terrible day, Heidi is collected by her aunt, a living aunt, and is made to live with a new family in town. Heidi can't bear to be away from her grandfather. Can she find her way back up the mountain where she belongs? So that is the antagonist of the book, the auntie. So I'm going to read a little here. Chapter 1, Up the Mountain. Look at my voice. Up the mountain. The pretty little Swiss town of Mayenfeld lies at the foot of a mountain range, whose grim, rugged peaks tower high above the valley below. Behind the town, a footpath winds gently up to the heights. The grass on the lower slopes is poor, but the air is fragrant with the scent of mountain flowers from the rich pasture land higher up. One sunny June morning, a tall, sturdy young woman was climbing up the path. She had a bundle in one hand and held a little girl, about 5 years old, by the other. The child's sunburned cheeks were flushed, which was not surprising, for though the sun was hot, she was wrapped up as though it was midwinter. It was difficult to see what she was like, for she was wearing 2 frocks, one on top of another, and had a large red scarf wound round and round and round as well. She looked like some shapeless bundle of clothing trudging uphill on a pair of hobnailed boots. After climbing for an hour, they came to the little village of Dorfli, halfway up the mountain. This was the woman's old home, and people called to her from their houses all the way up the street. She did not say much in reply, but went on her way without stopping until she reached the last house. Almost there, halfway. I'll come for you. Heidi, Heidi, Heidi. We'll soon be there. Keep going. See what strides you can take. We will keep going. Excuse me. So basically, she's trudging up the mountain trying to dump this girl, and everyone is trying to stop her on the way up the hill, up to where the grandfather lives at the top of the Alps. And they're all poor child and poor orphan and that poor girl and pity, 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 all the way up. So there's quite a bit of dialogue here. Then we get to, let's see if I can get to the scene where she finds her grandfather. Didi was watching as she went through towards a little brown wooden hut sheltering in a small hollow a few yards from the path. It was so dilapidated that it was a good thing that it got some protection from the full force of the mountain gales. Even so, it must have been wretched to live in, as all the doors and windows rattled every time the wind blew, and its rotten old beams creaked and shook. If it had been built in a more exposed position, it would certainly have been blown down into the valley long ago. This was Peter's home. So here's a little picture. So we get into very vivid descriptions of, poor mountain alpine life, all the goats that she meets along the way, all the flowers. She's kind of reminds me a lot of Anne of Green Gables, Anne Shirley, who she's fascinated with trees and nature and flowers and bridges and animals and the delight she finds. It's very mature from a 5-year-old's perspective. You wouldn't think that it was from a 5-year-old's perspective. So either way, it's just a very sweet, clean, pretty, uplifting, transformative story about the power of 2 oddball loners coming together to make a family of their own. And I think it's something I would recommend every child and adult read, honestly. So that is Heidi by Joanna Spyri. Let's get into my number 4 is What Katy Did by Sarah Chauncey Woolsey, under the name of Susan Coleridge. And this was written in 1872, another one of my Puffin classics. This is, again, What Katy Did. There are a few books in the series, What Katy Did Next, and then What Katy Did with something else. I don't remember. This was the first one. So Susan Coolidge being the pen name. What year was What Katy Did came out? I'm trying to look at my notes. I don't remember. I don't think I wrote that down. Anyway, this is about a 12-year-old girl named Katy. She's the oldest of all of her siblings. Their mother is dead. We have another orphan story. The orphan trope in children's literature, especially in the golden period of literature, was very commonplace. So she's the oldest. She's a little bit snooty, but she does take on the role of the caregiver of her siblings, but then she has a tragic accident. And in this tragic accident, she becomes an invalid or incapacitated for about 4 years. And during those 4 years, we see this tragedy of how the family has already lost so much and how she becomes like very selfish and demanding and pessimistic and depressive and naysayer-ish and making life difficult for everybody and petty and jealous. And she becomes the worst version of herself. But then as time goes on, other things happen, and she had to go through that process as she begins to recover and become a whole new person, becomes into being like a woman. She develops gratitude and thankfulness for her injury, and comes to appreciate the beautiful sunset coming on the sun and the warmth coming through the windows. And she learns how to be kind and compassionate and helpful despite her limitations. And she really learns the true meaning of love and has this complete transformation. So it's kind of a coming of age story, but through the perspective of a disability, which is very interesting at the time this was written. With diversity in children's literature these days, we want to see more with disabilities and race and LGBTQ. But at the time, writing a story like this was a little bit out there. And so it's short, quick read. Let's see if I can find a little something in here to read. The place to which the children were going was a sort of marshy thicket at the bottom of a field near the house. It wasn't a big thicket, but it looked big because the trees and bushes grew so closely that you could not see just where it ended. In the winter, the ground was damp and boggy, so that nobody went there, excepting cows, who didn't mind getting their feet wet. But in summer, the water dried away, and then it was all fresh and green and pretty and full of delightful things. Wild roses, sassafras, and birds' nests. Narrow winding paths ran here or there, made by the cattle as they wandered to and fro. This place the children called paradise, and to them it seemed as wide and endless and full of adventure as any forest or fairyland could ever offer. The way to paradise was through some wooden bars. So they lived on a town in Ohio, a farm-like town, where they had all this property as their playground, Katy and her siblings. Katy was also kind of gangly and unattractive and had low self-confidence at the age of 12 and didn't like how she looked and had these dreams of being this beautiful, glamorous, slim and rich woman. And then the accident happens, and largely there's a lesson of vanity in this book, that what is important in life is not what's on the outside, it's what is on the inside, and the gifts you're given just by being alive and your connections with other people. So there's some very deep meanings in this book and some beautiful passages as well. The path of peace got its name because of the darkness and coolness. High bushes almost met over it, and trees kept it shady even in the middle of the day. A sort of white flower grew there, which the children called polypods, because they didn't know the real name. They stayed a long while picking bunches of these flowers, and then grub up an armful of sassafras roots, so that before they had fairly gone through a toadstool avenue, as they named it, Rabbit Hollow, and the rest, and the sun, which was just over their heads, it now became noon. So it's written kind of from the perspective of the children describing their world, but it feels like it reads like an adult wrote it. So that's the kind of children's literature that I like. So this is What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge, a very unique read I had never heard of until I discovered it a few years ago. Okay, let's get on to my number 5 favorite piece of children's literature, which isn't in any particular order, by the way. Maybe Treasure Island is my first. This is actually the one I'm about to show you is probably my number 2. This book was written in 1947 by Marguerite Henry. It is Misty of Chincoteague. And I have here my hardback book that I had as a child in the 1980s in very good condition. I have all of the books in this series, which include these. Marguerite Henry wrote all of the horse stories. So we have Black Gold, we have Misty, Stormy Misty's Full, and Sea Star, and all these other horse stories. There's the White Stallion of Lepanza or something like that, which name I can't remember. Anyway, this story is about 2 siblings, a boy and a girl, who live with their grandparents on Chincoteague Island in Virginia. And it's all about, this book is based on loosely on the true story of the Beebe family, who were trying to raise these, pure horses and breed them and things like that. And it's told from the perspective partly of the horses, which is very interesting. We don't see a lot of that of animal perspectives. We do see that in Black Beauty. Now, at the time, when I was a child in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s in particular, is when I was reading all these horse stories. Horse stories were all the rage. And I think they were even before and after that. You look at Black Beauty, National Velvet, the Marguerite Henry books. We have the Black Stallion. And, why are horse themes in children's literature and classically so popular? We think of horses, we think of adventure, we think of freedom and being wild and running with the kids with their hair blowing in the wind and running across the fields and running on the beach in the ocean and freedom. And it makes children, the image that children get of thinking of riding horses makes them feel like an adult. They also makes them feel like free and like powerful, and it's exciting, and it gives them a feeling of feeling older. And it's kind of like a fantasy, like owning a horse. Like every child, at least every girl I've ever known, always wanted to own a horse when they were young. There's a reason. Not every girl wants to own a cat or a bird, but they always want to have a horse. So there's a reason for that. There's a lot of romanticism in literature around owning horses. There's a lot of elite status revolving around horses. And a lot of horses are large, so they seem more human-like in relation to a human. That, like, it's easier to bond to a horse than a really small animal like a hamster or a lizard or something like that. So anyway, absolutely brilliant. So what do I like about this book? Well, everything basically. So this actually was an award winner. This long wore off. The award came out way after the book did. I think it was a Caldecott, or was it a Newbery Award? One or the other. You guys are gonna have to look it up. I don't remember. I have all of these hardbacks. I have the whole set, and I absolutely love them, and they're illustrated. I'm going to read a little for you guys. Oh, and by the way, mine is autographed by Marguerite Henry. This book is worth something, you guys. Greetings from Marguerite Henry. I'm delighted that you share my love of horses. So this was actually written to my father was a president of a bank when I was in the 80s, and this was given to the vice president who worked for my dad, his daughter, by Marguerite Henry, and the daughter didn't want it. So my dad bought it from him and gave it to me. So it says to Tanya. It doesn't say to Emily, but hey. Anyway, so let's get in and look at some part one, Before Misty. And I love how this book I just love the feel of these old hardbacks. I love the illustrations. I love the writing. Beautiful descriptions of the island. And it really kind of makes you feel the compassion for the horses. Let's read a little. A wild, ringing neigh shrilled up from the hold of the Spanish galleon. It was not the cry of an animal in hunger. It was a terrifying bugle, an alarm call. The captain of the Santi Cristo strode the poop deck. Cursed be that stallion, he muttered under his breath as he stamped forward and back and back and back and forward. Suddenly he stopped short. The wind. It was dying with the sun. It was spilling out of the sails, causing them to quiver and shake. He could feel his flesh creep with the sails. Without wind, he could not get to Panama. And if he did get there, and get there soon, he was headed for trouble. The more ponies to be delivered to the Viceroy of Peru could not be kept alive much longer. Their hay had grown musty. The water casks were almost empty. And now this sudden calm, this heavy warning of a storm. He plucked nervously at his rusty black beard, as if that would help him think. We lie in the latitude of white squalls, he said, a look of vexation on his face. When the wind does strike, it will strike with fury. We must shorten the sail. Cupping his hands in the mouth, he bellowed, Furl the top-gallant sail, blah, blah, blah. Lots of ship talk here. The ship burst into action from forward, and all hands came running. The captain's eyes were fixed on his men, but his thoughts raced ahead to the rich land where he was bound. In his mind's eye, he could see the mule train coming to meet him when he reached land. He could see it snaking its way along the gold road from Panama to the seaport of Portobello. He almost could feel the smooth hand, the gold in the packs on the donkeys' backs. Gold, he mumbled. Gold. 20 ponies for gold. So this is basically the equivalent of a human slave ship carrying human slaves, but instead they're carrying horses. So right there, that's disturbing. His thoughts were brought up sharply. That shrill hoarse call. Again, it filled the air with him with a wild ring. His beady eyes darted to the lookout man on the crow's nest, then to the man on deck. Meanwhile, in the dark hold of the ship, a small bay stallion was pawing the floor of his stall. His iron shoes with their sharp rims and turned down heels threw a shower of sparks, and he felt strong charges of electricity. His nostrils flared, the moisture in the air, the charges of electricity. These were storm warnings, things he knew. Some inner urge told him he must get his mares to high land before the storm broke. He tried to escape, charging against the chestboard of his stall again and again. He threw his head back and bugled. From stalls behind him and from stalls opposite him, 19 heads with small pointed ears peered out. 19 pairs of brown eyes whitened. 19 young mares caught his anxiety. They too tried to escape, rearing and plunging and rearing and plunging. But presently the animals were no longer hurling themselves. They were being hurled. The ship was pitching and tossing to the rising swell of the sea, flinging the ponies forward against their chestboards, backward against the ship's sides. A cold wind spiraled down the hatch. It whistled and screamed above the rough voice of the captain. The sea became a wildcat now, and the galleon her prey. She stalked the ship and dove here off her course. She knocked the spars, used them to ram holes in her sides. The pressure of the sea swept everything before it. Huge baskets filled with gravel for ballast plumbed down the passageway between the ponies, breaking up stalls as they went by. Then the galleon shuddered. From bow to stern came an endless rasping sound. The ship had struck a shoal, and with a ripping and crashing of timber, the hull cracked open. In that split second, the captain, his men, his live cargo were washed into the boiling foam. The wildcat sea yawned. She swallowed the men. Only the captain and 15 ponies managed to come up again. The captain bobbed alongside the stallion and made a wild grasp of his tail, but a great wave swept him out of reach. The stallion neighed encouragement to his mares, who were struggling to keep afloat, fighting the wreckage and the sea. For a long minute they thrashed about helplessly, and just when their strength was nearly spent, the storm died as suddenly as it had risen, and the calm came. The sea was no longer a wildcat. She became a kitten, fawning and lapping about the pony's legs. Now their hooves touched land. They were able to stand. They were free. They were scrambling up the beach, up on Chincoteague Beach, that long sandy island which shelters the tideway country of Virginia and Maryland. They were very far from the mines in Peru. And there we have the end of the chapter. So I absolutely love it. I love how we have, again, all the illustrations. We have the perspective of the ponies. We have the characters of the children. So Misty, by the way, is a Palomino horse, I think. So this is probably my number 2. This was always my favorite children's book since I was a child. It still is, but now from an adult perspective, Treasure Island is probably my favorite. But if I had read Treasure Island as a kid, I would have hated it. So there you go. Those are my 5 favorite classic children's literature books / novels. And I have an entire shelf, several hundred. And these are my favorites. I'll link all these below. You won't be able to find the vintage version of this, but you can find these in modern paperback, the whole series. I've even seen the box series at Costco. The first few are my favorites. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, like the video, and tell me what you think. If you have any others you recommend, comment below. I'll see you in another video.